Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm privileged to welcome a very, very accomplished professional from Vancouver, Canada, Mr. Darryl Stickel. Darryl, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Ash. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you. Darryl is the founder of Trust Unlimited. He's one of the world's leading experts on trust. He's done his PhD in building trust in hostile environments, and he's an author. And all of you know I'm very partial to authors. He's an author of a book titled Building Trust, Exceptional Leadership in an Uncertain World. So, Darryl, let me start by asking you to tell me about your own journey and what led you to focus on trust.
It's a good question. I grew up in a small town in northern Canada.
Mm-hmm.
And it was pretty isolated. There was about 12 or 13,000 people there. And people had to pull together. There was this sense of community because you knew if you didn't help out your neighbor, they wouldn't be there to help you when trouble eventually came, when you were struggling. And so I developed this sense of if I could help people, I should. And I had a series of misadventures growing up, number of concussions and played sports and all that kind of stuff. And it led to me getting knocked around a bit. And it sort of honed that sense of empathy for others, that feeling like I could understand other people's perspective. And I found myself going to university in Victoria, and I'd be sitting on the bus and someone would sit down next to me and say, I'm really having a hard time. So for some reason, people were opening up to me, a complete stranger, and I wanted to understand what that was. And so I started a journey. I worked with families in crisis and troubled teens and street kids and worked on crisis lines and those kinds of things to hone those skills. But I eventually came to realize a lot of the people I was working with were just doing the best they could. And that even if you could see a path forward for them, they struggled to take it. And so I shifted and went into public administration. And I was working with the Canadian federal government in land claims. We have Indigenous land claims here that haven't been settled yet.
Yeah.
And so they would ask me these deep philosophical questions like, what is self-government? Or what will the province look like 50 years after claims are settled? And the last question they asked me was, how do we convince a group of people we've mistreated for over 100 years they should trust us?
Wow.
And I thought, wow, that's a good question. So I went to Duke and wrote my doctoral thesis on building trust in hostile environments.
Amazing. Amazing. Thank you. What a great response and what an amazing story. So let's talk a little bit about trust, Darryl.
Yeah.
How do you define trust in the context of leadership?
So trust is the willingness to make yourself vulnerable when you can't completely predict how someone else is going to behave. And when I think about trust as it pertains to leaders, I think the more senior we become, Ash, the less direct control we have over outcomes. The more important our ability to build trust with others becomes. All of our goals, all of our aspirations, all of our objectives are met through the actions of others. And a lot of times when I work with senior executives, I'll say, who do you trust? And they'll give me this close, tight group of personal relationships. And then I flip the question. I say, who trusts you? I get this long pause. And I say, well, let's go back to the definition. Trust is the willingness to make yourself vulnerable. How can your employees make themselves vulnerable to you, and do they? And so that becomes things like giving me the bad news before everyone else gets it, pushing back on ideas they don't think are going to work, trying new things, being innovative, creative, being willing to make mistakes and learn. Those are all ways that employees can make themselves vulnerable to a leader. And the question is, do they? And if they do, you've built a high trust culture. If they don't, you haven't.
Very interesting. And given the scenario that we are now in, which is we've got diverse global teams who are not even meeting other than maybe over a Zoom, how can leaders build trust with remote teams?
That's a great question. I work with a woman named Kelsey Trigg, who's the global VP for HR advisors for a company called SAP. huge global software organization. She's got people all over the world, and I've worked with her and her teams. She does an amazing job. And a big part of it is, when we start talking about trust, it feels like this fuzzy, nebulous concept that it's too complex for us to deal with. The reality is that we can be very intentional and systematic about building trust. And so for me, trust is a combination of uncertainty and vulnerability. It's, uncertainty times vulnerability gives us a level of perceived risk. And we each have a threshold of risk that we're comfortable with. If we go beyond that threshold, we don't trust. If we're beneath it, then we do. And so that means that if uncertainty is really high, then the range of vulnerability we can tolerate is really small. And as our uncertainty starts to go down, the range of vulnerability we can tolerate starts to grow. And so if we're trying to build trust in virtual teams, it means we need to understand where uncertainty comes from and how we take steps to reduce it. And, a lot of times, one of the pieces that's been missing, I think there are 10 levers we can pull to build trust. One of the things that's been missing is our ability to engage and interact interpersonally. That FaceTime that we get, where we pick up on cues from each other. So often when we do these Zoom calls, we're just so focused on task.
Correct.
We don't think about the other person as a human being. And so we miss that benevolence lever, that having someone else's best interest lever. And so a lot of times what I do is I walk people through, in the workshops that I do and the book that I wrote and the masterclass, it's always the same thing. It's teaching people about these different levers and how to pull them. And so I'll give people a template for a conversation around benevolence. Your listeners can try this in whatever way works best for them, but they can say, I heard this guy Darryl talking about trust, and he said benevolence is important. This belief that you've got my best interest at heart. And I think I do that, but it doesn't always seem to come across that way. Have you ever experienced that? And the other person's going to say yes, because almost all of us have. And then you start to narrow the funnel a little more, and you go, well, have you ever had someone really look out for you, really have your best interest at heart? What did they do? What did that look like? How did it feel? And now we're priming them, and we're getting some clues about how to act in a way that they see as benevolent. And then we narrow the funnel a little further, Ash, and we say, what would it look like if I was benevolent to you? What does success look like for you? How do I help you get there? And now we've created this mechanism for us to be transparent with one another, where we can talk about benevolence in a way that's actually got teeth to it, a way that we can gain traction and be applied about. So, yeah. So that's the approach.
Very, very interesting. And, you've used the word vulnerability, which is a part of the definition of trust.
Yeah.
Can you give my viewers and listeners an example of vulnerability?
Oh, that's a great question, because it's different for all of us in some ways.
Yeah.
I'm never more vulnerable than when it comes to my sons. I've got two sons that I adore. Things that are good for them are good for me. And harm that's done to them is harm to me.
Correct.
But if I share information with you that could later be used against me, if I express an opinion about something that's might be a taboo topic or a difficult subject, or if I tell you that I've failed at something, all of those are mechanisms of me making myself vulnerable. And it can be from as little as me lending you $20 to as important as me telling people about our relationship or our friendship, or sharing information I have about my history and my past. Those are all ways that I can make myself vulnerable. And I got to say, right now we're having a hard time with that, Ash, because, I told you what the formula is, right? And our vulnerability hasn't really gone down a whole lot, but our uncertainty is bouncing all over the place because of technological changes in norms and values, this sort of global leadership challenge that you've posed before, pandemics, all of these things are changing the rules.
Correct.
And that means that uncertainty is bouncing all over the place for us.
Correct. Well said. Thank you for such a good response. And my next question, Darryl, is that given the fact that trust is so important in any relationship,
yeah,
are there any tools available for leaders to be able to measure the level of trust in their organization?
There are. A lot of the measures aren't great.
Mm-hmm.
I have a measure that I use that relates to my model
Mm-hmm.
that looks at the willingness to be vulnerable. So we go through, Trust Unlimited is my company, and we go through and we'll ask a series of questions around the different levers, but we try to get a sense of how vulnerable people are comfortable being.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the best approach, one of the leaders I've worked with, her company measured trust levels, and it was a bad measure, but they had a scale from -100 to +100, and she was at 13. And I worked with her for a couple of months, did some coaching, showed her the model, and then had a conversation with her team where I said, here are some of the levers that we can pull to build trust with each other. One of them's benevolence. One of them's integrity. Do I follow through on my promises? Do my actions line up with my values? That kind of thing. One of them's ability. What could she do to pull these levers? And because now all of a sudden we'd created a shared vocabulary and they were able to have conversations about it, her score went from 13 to 80 within 2 months.
Wow.
And now she's been at 100 ever since.
How amazing.
And yeah, so in part, we get a sense if trust levels are low when we see things like a lot of political behavior, a lot of rumors, people being, passive and tentative. But yeah, if folks reach out to me, we can talk about a measurement tool that we use. Happy to do that.
Will do. Thank you. And my next question is, Darryl, that with all the leaders that you are working with or have worked with, is there a conflict inside them about the dissonance between maintaining authority and exhibiting vulnerability?
Absolutely. Oh my God, that's a great question, Ash. And that gets to one of the main problems that I've been seeing leaders struggle with right now. Is a lot of times they need to let go of the things that got them where they are.
Correct.
So if I'm great at software development, I need to let go of that.
Correct.
And let other people step into that void while I develop and hone a new set of skills so that I could be exceptional at my new role instead of just really good at my old one. But a lot of them struggle to do that because there's a vulnerability associated with learning new skills.
Correct.
We're going to make mistakes. We're going to fail. And there's this terror that these leaders have that if people see me making mistakes, they won't follow me. I'll lose my credibility with them. And the reality is that what we're creating there is a perception that it's not okay to make mistakes. It's not okay to learn new things. It's not okay to mess up. And so we end up having a workforce that's incredibly conservative and careful about only doing things they're good at. Instead of us learning and growing and developing together.
Well said.
Great question.
Thank you. And when you talk about trust, how does transparency and open communication contribute to the process of building trust?
It helps a lot because we're trying to reduce uncertainty. And, when I think about the model that I proposed, right? Uncertainty times vulnerability equals risk. For us to build trust, we just need to understand, where does uncertainty come from? Where does vulnerability come from? How do we take steps to reduce those? Right? It becomes fairly simple. And so transparency and candor have a huge impact because uncertainty comes from us as individuals and it comes from the context we're embedded in. Right? And so the more I'm able to have conversations with you and let you understand what my context is, how I'm constrained, the easier it is for you to predict my behavior. And the more that I'm able to share my understanding and my story of the world, the more chance there is that we're going to be aligned because we interpret the world through stories, Ash. Right. And if you and I have a different story, we may see the exact same event and have very different perceptions of what just happened.
Wonderful. Wonderful. My next question to you is about rebuilding trust. We have a lot of people leaders who may have broken the trust with employees or colleagues because maybe of their own actions or external circumstances. How can leaders effectively rebuild trust?
So a big part of it is, and you're kind of stepping right into my sweet spot now, because so many people are talking about trust, but they're not talking about how to build it. We rebuild trust by showing an understanding of the harm that was caused when we failed. If I disappointed you, say I hadn't shown up on time, then it would be on me to say, Ash, I'm really sorry that I was late. I understand that that causes some level of anxiety for you because you're producing this show, and it's your time and energy that's potentially wasted. And so I need to deconstruct the things that may be going on for you. And then I need to sort of invite you into the conversation by saying, have I covered the things that were bothering you? Or, you probably have a story going through your head of, Darryl's unreliable, or, he let me down, or this is intentional.
Right.
Is that right? And so we start by asking questions and trying to apologize for the harm that was done. And then we say, here's why it happened. Here's the story that I have. Maybe I'm technologically challenged, or something happened with one of my sons, or, if there's a reason why this happened, then I should be able to explain it to you. And I should also be able to say, I can't credibly commit that this is never going to happen again. And it would be wrong for me to make a promise that I don't have control over. But here's the steps I'm going to take to try to make sure that is less likely to happen. And so there's this sort of multiple components where we don't just apologize. And even if we're not responsible, say my boss told me, hey, you can't talk to Ash until X time, you got to get this task done. That's outside of my control, but I can still say, I'm sorry that this happened. And then explain how I think it impacted you.
Correct.
Ask for your story, and then explain my own version, and then talk about how I'm going to take steps to try to address that.
Fascinating. So one more question, and then I want to talk about your book.
Okay.
You have spoken about the model that you have built.
Right.
Can you tell me a little bit about the model and what does it do? Sure.
So the model starts off with the basis for trust, which are uncertainty and vulnerability. And it goes through and it looks at, there are 4 levers within uncertainty. So there are 3 of them that reside within us as individuals. That's benevolence, integrity, and ability.
Right.
And then there's the context, right? The rules of the game, the things that constrain us. And you're in India and I'm in Canada, so we have different rules, right? Different experiences, different upbringings. And this is the struggle that a lot of these leaders have, is that the context is slightly different. And so we don't know quite what rules each of us are playing by. And each of those is a lever that we can pull to build trust. Vulnerability is a combination of, what do I think is at stake? How do I value it? Right? Because you and I could have the same thing at stake in terms of money, but might have different valuations depending on where we are in our career path, or we may have different expectations about our friendship and how we value it, and those kinds of things. So those are other levers that we can pull, where we try to understand, what do you think is at stake? How do I help manage that for you? And then it leads to perceived outcomes. And I use the word perceived because we interpret the world through stories. We may have exactly the same experience, but different perceptions of whether it was a good outcome or not, and who was responsible. And so there's a couple levers we can pull there. And in the middle of all this is our emotional states, whether we like or dislike somebody else. And because I like you, I'm looking for confirming evidence for my positive story about you, Ash. And I see you smiling and nodding as I'm talking, and it confirms for me that Ash is a good guy. And you ask these great questions, and I get the sense Ash and I are really clicking. And so I find these positive stories to help confirm my decision that I should trust you. It makes me more likely to trust you. And then it makes me see the outcome more positively as well. Right. And I attribute it to you because you're so experienced at this. You're such a good guy. And that makes me like you even more. And so it creates this virtuous cycle.
Amazing. Yep.
If we see something different, if we don't like the other person, it's exactly the opposite. And we search for confirming evidence for a negative story, we're less likely to trust. We're more likely to see the outcome as negative. And it creates this vicious spiral. And this is why we see these long-term disputes that are so resilient.
Right.
Because we tend to take a cognitive, rational approach to these profoundly emotional problems. And we're not successful because we can't gain traction.
Right.
And so the model that I developed during my doctoral thesis, it included a number of things that still aren't included in most trust literature. So notions of the context, conversations around vulnerability, perceived outcomes, and these emotional states. Most of the research treats people like they're rational actors.
Fascinating. Fascinating. So Darryl, let's now move to your book. And the title is Building Trust, Exceptional Leadership in an Uncertain World. Before I ask you a question, I'm going to ask all our viewers and listeners to go and check out Mr. Darryl Stickel's book. I'm going to check out the book myself. So Darryl, tell me a little bit about what inspired you to write this book.
So I was having these incredibly powerful moments. I had one of my students, I was teaching in Luxembourg at the Luxembourg School of Business. One of my students, I'm teaching these MBA students, and their final project is to apply the model to a relationship. And one of my students chooses his two sons. They're 5 and 3 at the time. And he says, our relationship is completely estranged. I've worked for most of their lives in Brazil while they've lived in Luxembourg. I get around them. I don't know what to do. I'm scared. I make mistakes constantly. I'm always frustrated and angry. So I think the relationship's broken forever. And at the end of the course, after a bit of coaching and him going through the model and applying it, his final report said, my sons now run to me. They throw themselves on me, tell me they love me. They fight over who gets to sit next to me at dinner. It's a complete transformation. And I felt like I was dropping grains of sand in the ocean, Ash. And what I need is people like you and your listeners to come alongside me and pick up great big rocks. Because we can build trust. It's a skill that we can build. We just need to be understanding of it. We just need to know how it works and be more aware of it. And so that's why I wrote the book. I want to have broader impact.
Amazing.
I want to scale what I do, and I don't want it to go away if I do, Ash.
Correct. Well said. You also speak about the concept of emotional intelligence in your book as a vital component to trust building.
Right.
Tell me a little bit about emotional intelligence and how can most people build emotional intelligence?
So partly for me, a big component of emotional intelligence is empathy. It's understanding someone else's perspective, how our message lands, what their thought pattern might be. And I talk about this as either, Socratic approach or a coach approach. Daniel Goleman is the sort of grandfather of emotional intelligence work. But for me, a lot of this starts with getting curious about other people's story, about their perspective. And one of the exercises I've done with folks, I've had senior leaders who aren't getting along well, and I'll sit down with each of them independently and say, tell me what's going on. Tell me your story. And I get the story from each of them. Then I bring them together and I'll say, person A, you tell me person B's story. And it forces them to kind of think about what's the narrative that this other person might have. And how can I frame this in a way that they would accept as I'm extolling it back to them. And then I say, person B, you tell me person A's narrative. What do they think has happened? Wow, I guess they would probably think this and this and this. And it starts the journey of creating a shared narrative. And so for me, a lot of emotional intelligence boils down to me including you in the conversation.
Amazing.
Me having empathy for you and with you.
Fantastic. And Darryl, my last question to you, and this is for the thousands of people who will listen to our conversation. Based on your amazing understanding of trust,
right?
What would you say are 3 lessons you would want a lot of our young viewers and listeners to take away from your own understanding and from our conversation?
Right. So I think lesson 1, and this is one of the biggest challenges, 95% of people believe they're more trustworthy than average. And that creates problems. It's not only statistically impossible, but it means that when we see a problem in a relationship, we assume it's the other person's fault.
Yeah.
And so taking a a bit of introspection, understanding that we play a role in how our relationships unfold.
Yeah.
And that we can be intentional about that. That would be one of the lessons. Second lesson is that trust is probably one of the most important assets for a leader. It's probably the most important skill you can have. And it's also one of the few elements of your success or failure that's actually directly within your control.
Correct.
And so you can be intentional about it, and you can actually, it's a skill that you can build. And the third, I guess, would be, we interpret the world through stories. I find it helpful to start with a positive story about the other person. They may prove us wrong, but if we start with a positive story, then there's all kinds of potential for us to have conversation and reduce misunderstandings.
How amazing. And on that note, Darryl, in 3 amazing lessons, understand the other person, because most of us tend to believe that we are right and the other person may not be right. Second, which you said, is trust is so critical for a leader. Be intentional and train yourself to be able to build trust. And the third one you said, which is so fascinating and so powerful, start with the positive about everyone else. Thank you so much for speaking to me about your own journey. Thank you for speaking to me at such length about trust. I've learned so many new things about you from trust. Thank you also for talking to me about your model, and thank you for talking to me about your book. Thank you again, and good luck.
Thank you, Ash.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.